He had spent 27 months as the intelligence officer of Army Group Center on the Eastern Front. He had watched German armor drive toward Moscow in the summer of 1941 and watched the Soviet winter counteroffensive shatter that advance. He had read the casualty returns from the Rzhev salient, where the fighting consumed divisions the way a furnace consumes wood. He had been present at the operational level for Smolensk, for Orel, for the great German retreats of 1943. By any professional standard a German officer could apply in the autumn of 1944, Rudolf-Christoph Freiherr von Gersdorff had a precise and documented knowledge of what catastrophic ground combat looked like. And then he saw the Hurtgen Forest. Gersdorff was Oberst and Chief of Staff of the German 7th Army when American infantry entered those woods in September of 1944. He watched the fighting from the operational level for the entire battle. He watched American divisions go in and come out broken. He watched German divisions go in and come out the same way. He watched a forest roughly 50 square miles in area consume more men than some entire campaigns, and he watched it do so without producing anything that could reasonably be called a decision. When American historians sat down with him after the war as part of the United States Army Historical Division's Foreign Military Studies program, Gersdorff put his assessment on the record. His testimony is preserved in manuscript number A891 of the Foreign Military Studies series, produced in 1945 while he was in American captivity. It is 28 pages, written from the perspective of the German 7th Army's headquarters, covering the Hürtgen battle from November through early December of 1944. And in those pages is a sentence that historians of the campaign have been quoting ever since. He said the fighting in the Hurtgen Forest was the heaviest he had ever witnessed. He said it was worse than anything he had seen on the Russian front. He compared it in intensity not to any battle of the Second World War, but to the attritional infantry slaughter of the final years of the First World War. This is the man who said that. This is what he was comparing. This is why it mattered then, and why the document survives now. Rudolf-Christoph Freiherr von Gersdorff was born on 27 March 1905 in Silesia, the son of Baron Ernst von Gersdorff and Christine, née Countess Zudona Schlodian. He came from the old Prussian military nobility, and his career followed the path that background prescribed. He received his commission as lieutenant on 1 December 1926. By the time Germany went to war in September of 1939, he was on the staff of the 14th Army for the Polish campaign, then moved to the intelligence section of the 12th Corps, then to the operations section of the 86th Infantry Division for France in 1940. His promotions were steady: Major on 1 June 1940, Oberstleutnant on 1 March 1942, Oberst on 1 January 1943. By the time the Hürtgen battle opened in September of 1944, he held the rank of Oberst. American post-war sources that call him General Major during the Hürtgen are drawing on his later rank, not his rank during the fighting itself. He was promoted to General Major on 30th January 1945, after the main battle had ended. The Foreign Military Studies manuscript containing his Hürtgen testimony was written in 1945 under American interrogation, when that promotion had already occurred, which is where the retrospective confusion originated. The man who actually lived the battle as Chief of Staff of the 7th Army was an Oberst. What makes his assessment significant is not his rank, it is what he brought to it. If the documentary record matters to you more than the popular summary, the like button is what keeps this material surfacing for people who want the archive version. Hit it, and we stay in the record. On 22 June 1941, the opening day of Operation Barbarossa, Gersdorf became the IC of Army Group Center. IC was the designation for the Army Group's intelligence officer, the man responsible for maintaining the current picture of what the enemy was doing, what strength it possessed, and what it was likely to do next. He would hold that position for 27 consecutive months, through the drive toward Moscow in the summer and autumn of 1941, through the Soviet winter counteroffensive that came close to destroying Army Group Center in December of that year, through the attritional grinding of the Rzhev salient across 1942 and into 1943, through the German offensive at the Orel salient in July of 1943, the Soviet response called Operation Kutuzov, and the retreats that followed into autumn. He served under successive Army Group commanders, Fedor von Bock, Gunther von Kluge, and Ernst Busch, and he worked directly beneath Chief of Staff Henning von Tresckow, who was at the center of the military resistance against Hitler and who brought Gersdorf into it. The Rzhev salient deserves particular attention because it is one of the specific experiences Gersdorf was drawing on when he later judged the Hürtgen. The German salient around Rzhev, on the Upper Volga, was Territory Army Group Center held from the winter of 1941 through March of 1943. The Soviet High Command launched 4 major offensive operations against it across that period. The fighting was not the sweeping mobile warfare of summer 1941. It was static, close, and attritional. The terrain imposed many of the same constraints the Hürtgen would later impose: frozen solid in winter, deep mud in the thaw, crossed by rivers and streams, covered in dense forest that channeled any advance into narrow corridors where defense was cheap and attack expensive. Armor could not operate freely. What determined the outcome of most engagements was infantry and supply, and both were being consumed at rates the German command found difficult to sustain or explain to Berlin. The scale of what Army Group Center endured at Rzhev was not immediately legible from any single report. It accumulated across months. Soviet operations Mars and Jupiter, launched in November and December of 1942 in simultaneous assaults on the salient, were catastrophically costly for the Soviets without achieving their stated objectives, and yet they ground down the German formations, defending the salient at rates that alarmed the German operational staff precisely because the Soviet forces kept coming despite their own losses. Gersdorf, as the Army Group's intelligence officer, was reading those German divisional reports against his own assessments of Soviet losses. What the Rzhev fighting taught him, report by report across 2 years, was that determined infantry would take enormous casualties and keep attacking if the institutional structure behind them could sustain the replacement flow. He filed that knowledge away. He applied it in the Hürtgen. The difference was that in the Hürtgen, the infantry doing it were Americans, the replacement flow was American, and the institutional structure sustaining it was far more capable than anything he had watched on the Soviet side at Rzhev. Gersdorf, as Army Group Center's intelligence officer, read every divisional casualty report that came up through Corps and Army. He read the estimates of Soviet strength arriving from the east. He read the Corps assessments of what each depleted formation could still accomplish. Over 2 years of reading those reports, he built a precise operational understanding of what sustained close-quarters infantry attrition actually produced, not in the abstract but in terms of fighting strength, unit cohesion, and the point at which a formation stopped being a formation and became a collection of survivors. The Smolensk withdrawal of autumn 1943 added a different texture. Army Group Center conducted a fighting retreat under sustained Soviet pressure through terrain that rewarded the defender and punished the attacker. Gersdorf was reading the intelligence picture of Soviet forces pressing from the east throughout that process. He left the Eastern Front in September of 1943. By then he had accumulated a more direct operational knowledge of sustained infantry attrition than almost any German officer who would later serve in the West. The resistance work that Tresckow had drawn him into produced the episode for which Gersdorf is most widely known outside professional military history. On 21 March 1943, Gersdorf volunteered to assassinate Adolf Hitler at the Zeuhaus Armory on Unter den Linden in Berlin. The occasion was the Helden-Gedenktag, the Heroes' Remembrance Day commemoration. Hitler was to tour an exhibition of captured Soviet weapons. Göring, Himmler, Keitel, and Dönitz were present. Gersdorf had concealed 2 10-minute acid fuse detonators attached to plastic explosive in the pockets of his greatcoat. Hitler walked through the entire exhibition in under 10 minutes and departed. The fuses required longer. Gersdorf made his way to a public lavatory inside the Zughaus and defused both devices at the last possible moment. He was never suspected. He returned to the Eastern Front. He later helped procure and store the British-made plastic explosive that Claus von Stauffenberg would use in the 20th of July 1944 attempt. When the Gestapo worked through the lists of conspirators after that plot failed, Gersdorf's name was not extracted from any of the arrested or executed men. He survived the investigation. This is who he was when he sat down with American historians in 1945 and told them what the Hürtgen had been. He was not reconstructing a convenient record after the fact. He was a documented insider of the military resistance with 2 years of operational memory of the Eastern Front at its worst, giving a professional assessment to the men who had beaten him. That combination of attributes is what makes manuscript A891 something more than one officer's post-war opinion. On 29th of July 1944, after a brief posting as Chief of Staff of the 82nd Corps on the Channel Coast, Gersdorf became Chief of Staff of the German 7th Army. He would hold that position through the Falaise Pocket, the retreat across France, the fighting withdrawal to the West Wall, and then the Hürtgen. The 7th Army he joined had survived Normandy in name more than substance. The Falaise encirclement had destroyed most of its fighting power. The formations that reached the West Wall in early September of 1944 were skeletons of what they had been. General der Panzertruppe Erich Brandenberger commanded what amounted to a patchwork of depleted divisions, holding a front that required twice as many men to defend properly. Brandenberger had commanded on the Eastern Front from 1941 through 1944, leading the 8th Panzer Division, then the 59th Corps, then the 29th Corps in Russia. He arrived at the 7th Army with a depth of Eastern Front experience comparable to Gersdorf's. Their operational manuscripts from the Foreign Military Studies program, produced separately in American captivity in 1945, converge on the same assessment of what the Hürtgen demanded and what it cost. The forest they were asked to defend requires some description, because Gersdorf's comparison only makes full sense against the conditions the terrain actually created. The Hürtgenwald lies east of Aachen, on the northern edge of the Eifel Highlands. In 1944 it covered roughly 50 square miles of dense conifer plantation, mostly Sitka spruce, planted in rows close enough to prevent tank movement and, in the densest sections, close enough that 2 men could not easily walk abreast. The trees ran 60 to 90 feet tall. The canopy closed over most of the trails. The forest floor was dark even at midday, perpetually damp, cut by ravines and streams that became significant obstacles in wet weather. A network of logging roads provided the only viable routes for vehicles, and those roads became impassable in sustained rain. Concrete pillboxes and tank obstacles from the west wall ran through parts of the forest integrated into the tree line, forcing any attacking unit to reduce each one individually. When rain turned to sleet and snow and temperatures fell, the logging roads became ice or mud, and the men in the trees had no shelter from what the sky was doing. Trench foot and frostbite were pulling men out of German and American units before they made contact with the enemy. Gersdorf recorded the scale of American non-combat casualties in manuscript A891 specifically because it struck him as a professional anomaly. On the Eastern Front, cold weather casualties at that scale had been a German problem. In the Hürtgen, American soldiers were suffering them in a climate that by Russian standards should have been mild. The forest manufactured its own conditions, and both armies endured them. And then there was what happened to artillery shells when they struck the trees. In open ground, a shell detonating at ground level throws shrapnel horizontally, and a soldier trained to go flat has a reasonable chance of surviving it. In the Hürtgen, artillery on both sides was registered to burst in the treetops. The shells struck the upper branches and detonated there, driving shrapnel and wooden splinters downward onto the men below. The only protection was to press against the trunk of a large tree and hope the trunk was thick enough. Flat was where the splinters went. There was no escaping the tree bursts by instinct, because the instinct trained into every soldier, go to ground, worked against you here. Every man who spent time in those woods and left a written account mentioned them. They became the defining terror of the battle for men on both sides. Hemingway, embedded with the 22nd Infantry Regiment of the 4th Infantry Division in November of 1944, called it Passchendaele with tree bursts. He was reaching for the same historical reference Gersdorf would later reach for, the attritional battles of the First World War, the ones that consumed infantry without producing decisions, the ones where material advantages could not be converted into operational outcomes because the terrain absorbed them. Verdun, Passchendaele, the Somme. Both men, from their very different positions, saw the Hürtgen as belonging to that category of combat and to no other available category. The battle ran from 19th September 1944 through 16th December, when the Ardennes counter-offensive pulled the surviving forces on both sides into a different catastrophe. 88 days of continuous fighting in the same forest. The longest battle fought on German soil in the Second World War. By American reckoning, the second longest single battle in United States Army history after Bataan. The American chain of command ran from Lieutenant General Courtney H. Hodges at 1st Army down through Major General J. Lawton Collins at 7th Corps and Major General Leonard T. Gero at 5th Corps. The German chain ran from General Feldmarschall Walter Model at Army Group B through Brandenburger at the 7th Army and Gersdorf at its staff. The forest sector was held primarily by the 74th Corps under General der Infanterie Erich Strauber and the 81st Corps, first under General der Infanterie Friedrich Schack, and then under General Lieutenant Friedrich Koechling. What those corps had to hold the forest with was, by the standard of any earlier phase of the war, almost nothing. The 275th Infantry Division, commanded by General Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, bore the central defensive burden for the longest period. It entered the forest with roughly 5,000 men, was reinforced to approximately 6,500 with 150 artillery pieces including corps attachments, and was reduced to a shell by late November. Schmidt produced his own foreign military studies manuscript after the war describing what his division had experienced. That manuscript, which is held with the other foreign military studies materials in the National Archives, Record Group 549, contains Schmidt's assessment of the American tactical approach. The attacks came not with the sweeping flanking movements that had characterized mobile operations in France, but directly, down the roads and paths, against the prepared positions, at an intensity and continuity that the defending formations had difficulty matching even when their defensive positions were intact. The account from divisional level corroborates what Gersdorf recorded from army level. Schmidt was looking up the hill at the American infantry. Gersdorf was reading the reports that came in from Schmidt and every other formation in the forest. They arrived at the same conclusion from opposite sides of it. The Americans were not winning by converting their advantages. They were winning by refusing to stop. The American formations that entered the forest confirmed this from inside. The 9th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Louis A. Craig, went in first in September. It had fought in North Africa and Sicily, and its men were veterans of difficult terrain and prepared defences. In the Hürtgen, the 9th advanced roughly 3,000 yards and suffered approximately 4,500 casualties. 3,000 yards for 4,500 casualties is a ratio that belongs to the Somme of 1916, not to a campaign in which the attacking side held overwhelming air and armoured superiority. The 28th Infantry Division went in early November under Major General Norman D. Cotter, who had walked upright under fire on Vierville Beach on D-Day and been specifically cited for it. The Keystone Division attacked toward the town of Schmidt. It took Schmidt on 3rd November. It lost Schmidt on 4th November in a counterattack by the 116th Panzer Division. By 13th November, the 28th had suffered 6,184 casualties. 6,184 casualties in 11 days for the temporary possession of a single small German town. The 3rd Battalion of the 112th Infantry Regiment was effectively destroyed as a coherent unit. Replacements arrived and entered the casualty lists before many had learned the names of the men in their sections. The 4th Infantry Division, under Major General Raymond O. Barton, entered the battle in mid-November as part of Operation Queen. Its 22nd Infantry Regiment under Colonel Charles T. Lanham suffered 2,773 casualties in 18 days, approximately 86% of normal regimental strength. Rifle company casualty rates exceeded 140% as replacements cycled through, were committed, and became casualties themselves before the regiment came out of the line. The regiment's 12th Infantry, fighting simultaneously in a different sector of the same forest, lost 1,600 men in 9 days. Lanham later talked through what the Hürtgen had done to his regiment with Hemingway, who had been there for part of it. Hemingway spent years afterward trying to write it accurately and found that it resisted the fictional approach he brought to everything else he had witnessed. The 8th Infantry Division under Major General Donald A. Stroh followed the 4th and took the town of Hürtgen itself on 28 November. The 104th Infantry Division under Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, the Timberwolves, committed in the same autumn push. By the time December arrived and the Ardennes offensive opened, 1st Army had put 8 divisions through the forest. The The rate of advance achieved, measured against the cost paid, would have been recognized in any other terrain of the war as a catastrophic failure of operational planning. In the Hürtgen, it was the only rate the terrain allowed, and American infantry had sustained it for nearly 3 months. What the German command observed from Gersdorf's position, across all of that, was something his professional training had not prepared him to account for. The passage in manuscript A891 that historians have returned to most consistently is the one where Gersdorf put his bewilderment on the record, as cited in Edward G. Miller's 1995 study A Dark and Bloody Ground, published by Texas A&M University Press, and drawn directly from manuscript A891. Gersdorf wrote that the German command could not understand the reason for the strong American attacks in the Hurtgen Forest. The fighting in the wooded area, he observed, denied the American troops the advantages offered them by their air and armored forces, the superiority of which had been decisive in all the battles waged before. This is a precise professional observation, not a rhetorical one. Gersdorf was an intelligence officer by formation and by temperament. He looked at battlefields and read them. What he read in the Hurtgen was an American command committing its most powerful assets to terrain that neutralized both of them. The forest floor would not carry armor in numbers. The canopy defeated close air support. The battlefield American armor and American aviation had dominated from Normandy through the liberation of Paris had ceased to exist as a relevant environment. What replaced it was close-range infantry combat in poor visibility, wet weather, and broken terrain defended by positions that could only be cleared one at a time. This was the one environment in which the material gap between the German and American armies narrowed toward its minimum. Gersdorf's professional doctrine, built from 2 years of reading Eastern Front intelligence, told him that an attacking army in this situation would do one of several things. It would shift its axis of advance to terrain more favorable to its advantages. It would pause and wait for conditions to change. Or it would take the attrition long enough to realize the cost was unsustainable and withdraw to regroup. All 3 of these responses were things he had watched happen on the Eastern Front when armies found themselves attacking in conditions that negated their material advantages. The Soviet High Command had made exactly these calculations in the course of the Rzhev fighting, periodically pausing offensive operations when the cost became too high relative to the ground gained, then resuming when reserves had been rebuilt. This was not cowardice. It was operational logic. It was what professional armies did. The American army in the Hürtgen did not do any of those things. First Army kept committing fresh divisions to the same ground, accepting the same casualty rates, for 88 days. Gersdorf watched it from his headquarters and could not read the operational logic behind it. The ground the Americans were taking was not ground that, by any measure he could apply, justified the price they were paying. The forest neutralized their air power. The terrain neutralized their armor. The only thing they were bringing to the fight that could not be neutralized by the Hürtgen was their infantry, and the infantry was what was being destroyed. That Gersdorf found this inexplicable is itself a measure of something. He was one of the most capable intelligence officers in the German army, and the Americans had done something he could not account for within the professional framework he had spent 2 years constructing. That Gersdorf could not understand why the Americans chose it is not a failure of analysis. It reflects the fact that the American strategic logic, centered on the need to seize or neutralize the Ruhr River dams before any Rhine crossing became possible, was not legible from the 7th Army's headquarters in the way it should have been visible from 1st Army's. A German force controlling those dams could flood the Ruhr Valley on command, trapping any American crossing force in the lowlands. That strategic constraint was real. The route chosen to address it, straight through the worst terrain on the German border, was not the only option available. It was the most expensive one imaginable. The decision to keep committing fresh divisions to that route, month after month, is the central question American military historians have been trying to answer about the Hürtgen ever since. Gavin asked it in 1979. MacDonald had implied it in 1963. Neither found an answer that fully satisfied the professional standard Gersdorf had applied from the other side of the wire. This was what Gersdorf was reading from his headquarters across those 88 days. He could not understand why the Americans kept accepting the cost. And then he watched them accept it until the forest ran out. What Gersdorf observed from his side of the wire, and what made his comparison to the Eastern Front precise rather than rhetorical, was a specific failure of the breaking point he had learned to expect. On the Eastern Front, Gersdorf had spent 2 years reading reports that described a consistent pattern. A formation absorbs casualties until it reaches the point at which unit cohesion breaks down, and at which it stops functioning as a tactical organization, regardless of how many men technically remain. He had watched it arrive for German divisions and Soviet divisions alike, across 27 months. The pattern was reliable enough that it shaped how the German command allocated reserves and planned relief operations. When a formation reached a certain threshold of attrition, it came out. Another went in. In the Hürtgen, the breaking point he expected to see arrive for American divisions did not arrive in the way the Eastern Front had established as normal. Robert S. Rush, in Hell in Hurtgen Forest, published by the University Press of Kansas in 2001, and drawing extensively on Gersdorff's manuscripts, argues that the structural explanation lies in the American individual replacement system. German divisions replaced losses by rotating shattered units out of the line and committing fresh formations in their place. The Americans replaced losses by feeding individual soldiers into units that remained continuously in the line. A German division reduced past its functional threshold had to be pulled back. An American division receiving individual replacements at the same rate it was losing men could, in principle, maintain its position in the line and continue attacking regardless of the experience level of the men doing it. The cost at the individual level was severe. Men arrived at the front knowing no one, with no knowledge of the ground, and became casualties before they had established any of the informal knowledge that keeps soldiers alive in sustained combat. The replacement system maintained unit strength on paper, while continuously diluting the experience base that made units functional. Platoon leaders did not know their squads. Company commanders did not know their platoons. The institutional memory that a unit builds across a campaign was being drained and simultaneously refilled with something that was not equivalent to what it replaced. This was the paradox of the system, and the Hürtgen is the battle that exposed it most clearly on both sides of the ledger. But from Gersdorff's side of the wire, what he was observing was the effect rather than the mechanism. American infantry formations absorbed what his professional judgment told him should be disabling losses, and then kept attacking. He saw them take objectives that German formations in comparable states of depletion could not have reached. What the record shows, and what Miller's analysis in A Dark and Bloody Ground addresses directly, is that the bewilderment Gersdorff recorded was not the bewilderment of a man who had underestimated his enemy. He had not underestimated American material strength at any point. His intelligence assessments from Army Group Center had been consistently realistic about Soviet capacity, which was the hardest thing for a German intelligence officer on the Eastern Front to be realistic about. The institutional pressure to report favorable assessments was considerable. The professional consequences of accurate ones were often unwelcome. Gersdorff had maintained accurate assessments anyway. When he arrived in the West, he brought the same habit. What surprised him in the Hürtgen was not that the Americans were powerful. He knew they were powerful. What surprised him was that they were willing to absorb a specific kind of suffering, in a specific kind of terrain, for a duration that by every precedent he had established should have produced a pause, a reconsideration, or a different approach. The Rzhev fighting had been brutal, but it was periodically interrupted by large-scale Soviet offensive operations, German counterattacks, and the positional adjustments that gave both sides operational breathing space, however brief. The Hürtgen had none of that. The terrain did not permit operational maneuver. The battle was stripped down to what infantry could do in dense conifer forest, which is to say it was stripped down to almost nothing except persistence. And the Americans had more of it than any army Gersdorff had watched across the previous 2 years. That is what he wrote in manuscript A891. Not a tribute to American bravery in the abstract sense, a professional assessment of a specific military capability he had not previously encountered at this scale and duration. Gersdorff was describing them accurately, in the same way he had described the Soviets accurately for 2 years on the Eastern Front, in reports that were not always welcome. The habit was the same, the subject had changed. The Eastern Front was his professional standard for what war at its worst looked like. The Hürtgen exceeded that standard. If this is the kind of documentary material you want more of, the subscribe button is what brings the next record to you. There is no mechanism more complicated than that. You subscribe, the next document arrives. The German formations Gersdorf was managing through this battle are their own record of what the Forest was doing to the 7th Army. From September through December, the 275th Infantry Division bore the central defensive burden, entering intact and departing as a formation in name only. After it came the 353rd Infantry Division, which was committed, withdrawn, and committed again on 27th November. The 89th Infantry Division, whose troops together with the 116th Panzer Division encircled the 3rd Battalion of the 112th Infantry at Schmidt on 4th November, was itself reduced below effective strength before December. The 344th Infantry Division was rushed in from other sectors and committed on 21st November. The 12th Volksgrenadier Division followed, approximately 6,381 men at commitment. The 272nd Volksgrenadier Division came in the later phase, its 980th Grenadier Regiment defending Hill 400, the Bergstein Heights, against Lieutenant Colonel James E. Rudder's 2nd Ranger Battalion in December. Rudder had commanded the 2nd Rangers at Pointe du Hoc on D-Day. Elements of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, the 47th Volksgrenadier Division, the 85th Infantry Division, the 246th Volksgrenadier Division, the 347th Infantry Division, and the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division all rotated through the forest at various points across the battle. Total German strength committed to the sector over the full battle reached somewhere between 80,000 and 95,000 troops, though never more than 25,000 to 30,000 in line at any given moment. German casualties are estimated at approximately 28,000 in the main phase, drawn from Charles B. MacDonald's The Siegfried Line Campaign, published by the United States Army Center of Military History in 1963. German divisional war diaries for several formations committed to the Hürtgen did not survive the end of the war, so the figure is an estimate built from multiple incomplete sources. American casualties totaled approximately 33,000 battle and non-battle losses combined, with some scholarly estimates pushing the aggregate replacement losses considerably higher over the full duration of the campaign. Brandenberger's operational manuscripts from the Foreign Military Studies program confirm what Gersdorf recorded at army level. Brandenberger wrote that the 7th Army was simultaneously trying to defend the forest with depleted formations, absorb replacement drafts arriving undertrained and under-equipped, and accumulate the reserves that Hitler's Ardennes planning required. The Hürtgen was consuming those reserves before they could be assembled for Operation Watch on the Rhine. The forest was eating the army Germany needed for its last major offensive in the West, and neither man at 7th Army headquarters had a mechanism to stop it that did not require cancelling an offensive Hitler had already decided upon. Here is what the full record shows, placed together. Gersdorf produced Foreign Military Studies manuscript A891 in 1945, in American captivity, for military historians who had access to the other side of the record. He had no incentive to flatter the Americans and no incentive to minimize the Eastern Front, where his own army group had borne the greatest continuous burden of the war. His assessment that the Hürtgen exceeded what he had witnessed in Russia was not a post-war compliment designed to serve any political purpose. It was a professional judgment delivered under conditions that made inflation of it pointless. Charles B. MacDonald is the figure who first embedded that judgment in the permanent scholarly record. MacDonald served as a rifle company commander in the 23rd Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division, fighting at Krinkelt-Rocherath during the opening of the Ardennes offensive in December of 1944, adjacent to the Hürtgen sector. After the war, he joined the United States Army Center of Military History and became the official historian of the European theater's autumn and winter campaigns. His 1963 study, The Siegfried Line Campaign, was the first major scholarly work to draw on the Foreign Military Studies series comprehensively, and to use Gersdorf's testimony as a primary source for understanding the battle from the German operational level. His citation of manuscript A891 in the official history gave the document its permanent place in the scholarly literature. James M. Gavin's engagement with Gersdorf's testimony came from a different direction. Gavin commanded the 82nd Airborne Division when it entered the forest in February of 1945 to complete operations toward the Roa River. His 1979 American Heritage article, published in the December issue of Volume 31 and titled Bloody Hürtgen, The Battle That Should Never Have Been Fought, was a direct criticism of the American command decisions that committed 8 divisions to the worst terrain on the German border without a clear operational plan for the Roa dams. Gavin used Gersdorff's comparison of the Hürtgen to the Eastern Front as the most authoritative outside indictment available because it came from the professional soldier who had seen both theatres and had no American career to protect when he said what he thought. Miller's A Dark and Bloody Ground, published by Texas A&M University Press in 1995 and winner of the Forest C. Pogue Award in 1996, is the most complete scholarly treatment to draw on manuscript A891 in its original form. Miller reproduced the core passage in translation and used it as the structural center of his German-side assessment. Rush's Hell in Hurtgen Forest, published by the University Press of Kansas in 2001, used Gersdorff's testimony as a principal element of its argument about the replacement system and American infantry persistence. Taken together, these 4 works, MacDonald's Official History, Gavin's American Heritage article, Miller's monograph, and Rush's regimental study, form the citation chain that carried Gersdorff's assessment from a 28-page manuscript written in American captivity in 1945 to the permanent historiography of the battle. The chain is unbroken because the assessment is accurate. Manuscript A891 says what it says, and every major study of the Hürtgen that has tested it against the record has found it to hold. The document has earned that citation history. It was written for the men who won the battle. They verified it against what they knew. It survived verification. It is also worth being specific about what the Foreign Military Studies program actually was, because that context is part of what makes manuscript A891 a different category of evidence from the German officers' post-war memoirs that have sometimes been questioned by historians for their self-serving character. The program was established under Generaloberst Franz Halder, the former chief of the German Army General Staff, who was himself in American captivity after 1945, and who organized the participation of German officers. The American historians directing the program had access to the American operational records, the German divisional reports captured during the war, and the ultra-intelligence files. They were not passive recipients of whatever the German officers chose to say. They were cross-checking. An officer who wrote something in his Foreign Military Studies manuscript that was contradicted by the American or captured German record risked having the contradiction pointed out directly, which affected his standing with the program and potentially his treatment as a prisoner. The structural incentives within the program pushed toward accuracy on operational and tactical questions in ways that post-war memoir writing, aimed at a German or international readership, did not. This is why the scholars who have worked most carefully with the Foreign Military Studies material, MacDonald, Rush, Miller, treat it as a primary source of first-order reliability on operational questions, rather than as a secondary account to be treated with the skepticism appropriate to memoir. Oberst Rudolf-Christoph Freiherr von Gersdorff was released from American captivity in 1947. He applied to join the West German Bundeswehr after 1955 and was rejected. He became founding president of the Johanniter Unfallhilfe, the emergency relief service of the Order of St. John, which he led from 1952 to 1963, and received the Grosses Verdienstkreuz, the Grand Cross of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany, in 1979. A riding accident in 1967 left him paraplegic for the remaining 13 years of his life. He died in Munich on 27 January 1980, age 74. His memoir, Soldat I am Untergang, Soldier in the Downfall, was published by Ullstein Verlag in Frankfurt am Main in 1977. No English-language translation has been published. The scholar Johannes Hörter of the Institute für Zeitgeschichte in Munich has demonstrated, using the surviving Army Group Center documents, that some of Gersdorff's memoir claims about his own resistance to the criminal orders issued at the start of Barbarossa are not supported by the contemporaneous records. The memoir presents a cleaner version of his wartime conduct than the wartime files allow. This is worth stating plainly. because it is the kind of detail that determines how a source should be used and in what way. The distinction between the memoir and the foreign military studies manuscripts is therefore not a minor technical point. They are different kinds of documents produced under different conditions for different audiences. Soldat im Untergang was written between 1967 and 1977, 3 decades after the events it describes, by a man who was paraplegic, who knew how the war had ended, who knew what the resistance conspiracy had come to mean in post-war German memory, and who had every personal and professional incentive to present his own wartime conduct in the most favorable light the facts would allow, and perhaps slightly beyond what the facts allowed. Manuscript A891 was written in 1945, within months of the events it describes, by a man who was a prisoner and who was being asked operational and tactical questions by historians with access to records that could contradict him. The two documents require different levels of critical distance. The memoir requires more, the manuscript requires less. Scholars who have worked carefully with both, including Hürtgen on the memoir side and MacDonald, Rush, and Miller on the manuscript side, have reached exactly that conclusion. None of this touches the Hürtgen testimony itself, and it would be wrong to suggest it does. The operational and tactical content of manuscript A891 has been corroborated by every major scholarly study of the campaign. It says what the forest was. It says what the fighting cost. And it says, on the record, that the man who wrote it had seen the Eastern Front for 27 months and judged the Hürtgen worse than all of it. The manuscripts are held at the National Archives, Record Group 549, Records of United States Army Europe, Historical Division, Foreign Military Studies. Microfilm copies are at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg. I am Breisgau, and at the United States Army Center of Military History. The German-language originals that Gersdorff wrote are preserved in both locations, alongside the manuscripts of Brandenberger, Schmidt, and the other 7th Army and Corps commanders, who produced their own accounts of the same battle. If a like helps the record find the people who want it rather than the summary, that is what the button is for. Subscribe, and the next document arrives in your feed. He had seen Russia. He had been there for 27 months. He had tried to end the war before any of it happened, with 2 detonators in the pockets of his coat, in a building where Hitler walked faster than the fuses burned. He could not end it then. What he could do in 1945 was tell the truth about what the war had been to the men who had beaten him, in a document they could verify. The men who saw America in war wrote what they saw in their own hands. This is one of those records.